In laying out the structure of our hub, we had a number of challenges that were new and specific to co-op play. We have to assume that each player has made different progress throughout the game, playing with different partners. Starting in the neutral center of the hub was a way of making sure that they had a chance and place to coordinate. Players needed a way to agree on where to go, and a way to visualize each other's completion data. As they played, they needed concrete feedback on how much progress they had made. In seeking solutions, we felt it was important to keep the player in the game space, rather than resorting to menus and UI that would take them out of the game. Therefore, players can clearly see their status over the doors, and they navigate by walking to the course in the 3D space. GLaDOS is there to connect the experience to the single-player game, while also holding the player's hands a bit to keep the co-op goals and feedback clear.
The visual design of the robots began with lots of concept art. The initial round of concepts explored all kinds of forms, from human to the more abstract. We found ourselves gravitating towards shapes that reminded us of the sphere and the turret in the original Portal. Whilst keeping with the established Portal design aesthetic, we were keen to create all new characters, and being a duo, it was important that they were their own separate designs, rather than identical copies of each other. Unlike, for instance, Team Fortress 2, where a clean silhouette is essential for communicating the nature of a character, we had an opportunity here to play with designs that were a bit messy, with things sticking out of them so they looked half manufactured, half improvised. Once we had agreed on rough designs in 2D, we began to build the shapes in 3D, and this is where the next level of improvisation and experimentation occurred. Usually, a model will be designed and built in 3D and then rigged for animation, but here we allowed the rigging process to inform the models. We wanted to celebrate the mechanics of robots. We allowed function to dictate form, and in terms of detail, they started to design themselves once you start thinking about motors, ball joints, actuators, and all that sort of thing. The classic duo is often made up of two contrasting body types, short and squat next to tall and wiry, and it's not hard to see Laurel and Hardy, C-3PO and R2-D2 in these characters. Even though we had the freedom to make our silhouettes a bit untidy, it was still important that they remain readable as anthropomorphic bipeds. We wanted players to feel free to make mischief for their partners, in a typically human way, but without creating any kind of gore. The robots were perfect for this.
Our initial goal in designing the hub was to provide players with a lot of choices, so that they could sample a variety of game types. The idea was that if they got stuck or needed a break, they could pick another test chamber or another mechanic to explore. In reality, this prevented us from doing sufficient training and limited the overall scope of the puzzles. With such a flat structure, it was much harder to layer old mechanics onto new ones, because we couldn't guarantee that players understood what they needed to know to solve a puzzle. By going linear, we could guarantee prior knowledge and provide a much better experience, more satisfying pacing, and a story that gathered momentum over a long period of time.
In our original robot designs and the first animation tests, we started with the premise that, being robots, their movement should have limited personality and be a bit more mechanical. The feedback of our game testers and the reaction of our fans to the trailers convinced us that a more whimsical approach to animation would lead to a better experience. So we moved away from a sterile approach and found a whole new range of possibilities as we began to explore their personalities and gestures.
Since the co-op characters can die at any time, we needed a way to rebuild them quickly and often. Therefore, in co-op, we replaced the elevators that connected test chambers in single-player with disassembly machines. These are meant to reinforce the idea that since the robots are disposable, being destroyed is no big deal. In the robot world, it happens all the time.
I was confident you could finish. Do you know where I was? I was outside watching some deer frolic. You don't even care about the outside, do you?
In our first implementation, gestures were automatically selected based on the player's context. For example, blue might do a special gesture when standing on a floor button. Players became bored of seeing these gestures so quickly that they stopped using them before discovering any of the special context. Because of this, we decided to give players control of gestures as a way to express themselves. But when shown the full set from the start, they were overwhelmed by all the choices. By awarding gestures as the game progresses, we allow players to familiarize themselves with each gesture in turn. Leaving visible empty slots in the gesture wheel lets players anticipate that they'll be rewarded with cool new gestures as they progress. The gesture wheel provides quick access so that players can feel comfortable tossing out a gesture during downtime, letting them pick the perfect moment to share a high five.
We have a taunt where one robot steals the other's core. When implemented, it was the only taunt that required one person to initiate. Because of this, we were afraid that it would be used for griefing. We were in the process of rethinking our approach when early playtesters rated this as their favorite taunt. It was also the most used team taunt because it only required one player to initiate and was easier to use than the others. We ended up changing all the other team taunts to emulate the way stealing the core works.
Airlocks were introduced mainly as a way to allow players to focus on individual puzzles. In some of our early investigations, areas contained puzzles that were meant to be solved as a group, as well as others that were for individual solution. But we found that if players could move freely between them, they logically assumed that the individual puzzles were part of one big puzzle. This had bad results. For clarity, we created these airlock-like spawn rooms that act as checkpoints between puzzles. Once both players entered the airlock, we lock off access.
In Left 4 Dead 2, we authored simple, fogged, black versions of the world as monolithic models to avoid the CPU overhead of rendering the world again for water reflections. This worked well for the Left 4 Dead 2 outdoor environments where most light comes from the sky. But Portal 2 is almost entirely indoors, so the color and value of the world geometry is apparent in the water reflections. Since the Portal 2 world geometry is relatively simple, we automatically build a version of the world geometry that has a single texture that combines both lighting and surface shading, along with another texture that has just surface shading. The latter texture is used when rendering dynamic lights. These textures are at the same spatial resolution as the light maps and get packed into a single large atlas texture per level. Drawing this simple world imposter takes very little CPU time, which was a limited resource on Portal 2 due to the many portal views, split-screen views, and water reflection views that we needed to render. We initially planned on using the world imposters only for water reflection rendering, but we ended up using it to improve the performance in split-screen mode, where it is used for rendering distant portals and portals that are 2 levels deep. We also used the world imposters to render water in full-screen co-op mode, to give us some performance overhead, since the co-op mode has more portal views to render than single-player mode.
Normally in games when players die, they see this as a big failure. But in Portal, death is a normal part of the puzzle-solving experience. In co-op, death not only happens more frequently, but it can happen at the hands of your partner, purely accidentally, of course. We felt it was important to not only make death no big deal, but to make it fun. Early on, we tried some elaborate death animations, such as showing your robot slowly getting crushed under a giant crusher. These were awesome to watch, but they quickly became repetitive. Also, after a very short while, players grew afraid to take risks. The fear of having to wait a long time before trying again prevented them from simply playing and experimenting in a spirit of fun. We had to find the right balance where death was quick enough to be a non-penalty, and elaborate enough to be visceral and satisfying, a fun payoff for creative play.
We noticed that after playtesters had solved a difficult puzzle together, they'd sometimes pause before funneling through the exit door to repeatedly jump up and down in excitement. We realized that these meeting places would be the perfect time to allow players to high-five each other and celebrate their victory in style. Our first interface attempt had one player initiate a high five by holding their hand up and waiting. The other player could join in by selecting the same gesture. If they were standing in the correct positions relative to each other, they'd pull off a high five. But learning the correct place to stand was too difficult, so we decided to automatically move the bots into the correct position for the high five. Sometimes, however, the player who wanted to high five would be left hanging as the other player ran ahead without accepting. Increasing the time that the initiator waited with his hand up gave the other player time to return and accept. But being frozen into place for more than a few seconds was too frustrating. So finally, we made players auto-accept the team gestures. Now when the mood strikes either player, the game always ensures a successful celebration.
Early on, we realized that trying to tell your partner where to go, where to look, or where to place a portal was going to be really hard. Even with voice chat, saying over there doesn't give enough information to your partner within the 3D space. Players kept wanting to get up and point directly at their partner's screen. We developed the ping tool to address this problem. Because the ping tool was so important, we decided to train players in its use before we did anything else. We held back on the vast majority of player actions and let the players focus entirely on the ping tool. This is why the co-op bots start separated in a tube, without even the ability to walk or shoot a portal.
Something that really surprised us was how often playtesters stated that they loved the basic experience of handing off a cube to their partner. Players didn't expect such a fundamental physical interaction to just work in a game. Before trying it for the first time, they would discuss their plan as if it were some unique or special new game mechanic. When it just worked, they were overjoyed.
Several puzzles in the game require the players to take on distinct, intertwined roles. We called these asymmetric chambers trust puzzles, because one player is often placing their life in the hands of the other. When one player accidentally kills the other, it almost always ends in laughter. So much laughter that we sometimes had to question if it really was a legitimate accident. These puzzles also require players to stay in constant communication, which naturally leads to some great moments of cooperative bonding. While some teams found these stressful, for many partners, these puzzles were their favorite type. But everyone agreed that they added much-needed variety and a nice change of pace. And by swapping roles, each player can get an entirely different experience within the exact same puzzle.
Most players don't realize that the ping tool is context sensitive. When they're playing voice enabled, players usually rely on the look portion of the ping tool. Without voice, icons such as press the button or stand here become much more important.
It took a while for us to dial in the right approach for the co-op bot vocalizations. Initially, we recorded some in-house vocal performances and processed them heavily, with the resulting sounds being very robotic. However, as the animations being created for the bots were so broad and expressive, we soon realized we were going to need to try a different sonic approach. After a few more in-house experiments, we brought in D. Bradley Baker, who we had worked with to create the voices for some of Left 4 Dead's Special Infected. We worked with Dee to come up with 2 distinct vocal and character approaches for the bots and recorded a range of responses for each. Afterward, 2 of our sound designers each took on one of the voices and came up with a unique sound processing approach to create a distinct sonic personality for each bot that still allowed the energy and expression of Dee's performances to shine through. In the following samples, you can hear what they sounded like in Dee's original performance and the result after the sound designers got through with them.
It's important to give co-op players a way to coordinate their action. Seeing how our players naturally wanted this ability, we decided to support it with the ping timer and ended up designing some puzzles around it. Due to lag and other issues, syncing up actions over voice chat turned out to be rather difficult. Therefore, we created the countdown timer as a way for players to keep in sync. It's completely predictable. Both players see the go at the same instant, and the clocks run in sync even if they're on different systems.
This puzzle requires one of Portal's trickiest logical leaps. Early playtesters often took longer than their patience would allow and were nearly ripping out their hair by the time they'd finally solved it. But almost everyone insisted that the payoff was by far their favorite moment in all of co-op. We significantly reduced the average solution time by adding a puzzle just before this where 2 cubes repeatedly collide, but this almost completely robbed the appeal from what was once a high moment. So instead, we decided to make a few subtle adjustments and leave players with the responsibility to make the final leap. First, we added a puzzle 4 chambers earlier to teach players to fling by cutting their hard light bridge and falling into a surface directly below. We then subconsciously primed the thought of mid-air collision by having players repeatedly ricochet weighted spheres against a hard light bridge. Finally, we designed this room's layout, lighting, and decals so that players would see the entire space as a symmetrical whole and visualize the bot's fling path. By planting shards of the idea in their heads, we allow players to own that exciting dual collision epiphany while keeping their sanity intact.
For a while, we were on the fence about whether to keep the Team Taunt hug in the game. Some felt it wasn't suitably robotic, while others had a concern that perhaps it showed too much emotion for these characters. But once it was animated for a trade show trailer, many of our concerns were washed away by the positive reaction of the fans. It was a huge success.
The levels in Portal 2 are much more complex than in the first game, and as a result, we've had to beef up the player movement algorithms. The player is represented as an axis-aligned box in the world, which creates a problem for portal teleportation because portal teleportation is almost never axis-aligned. To improve how we handle this, we trace the player as the axis-aligned bounding box they would use on each side of a portal simultaneously, and merge the results into something usable. We have to predict quite a bit more than previous Source Engine games because portals and projected entities change the way the player moves through the world. Prediction itself is a mind-bending headache when dealing with portals. We're already dealing with a non-linear space, now we also have to deal with non-linear time in a non-linear space.
Writing GLaDOS for co-op introduces some interesting problems. In single player, you can count on players paying attention and being caught up in important moments. In co-op, you can count on two players chatting about what they just did as GLaDOS delivers an important line. To help with this issue, we broke up the story beats into smaller sections so players don't become impatient. We also repeat the points multiple times to ensure the message sinks in even if you missed it a few times. Lastly, we also give players room to talk. For example, when you die, there's a 2-second beat for you to laugh or yell before GLaDOS speaks. It's important to give those places for players to speak because the best part of co-op is the shared experience.